Let's take a break from all that sinister World of Darkness stuff by looking at something a little more lighthearted. Like the fact that most of the men in our society live in a constant state of alienation, and they don't even know it. If you're one of the many people who are new to the channel, hi, hello, welcome. This is something I also do. I made this channel to talk about social issues, and I'm gonna continue to do so. I will, of course, also get back to games eventually, because that's also why I made the channel. There is a decent chance you have seen that famous screenshot of a Tumblr post authored by a trans man. It's been making the rounds on Discord and Twitter, and a lot of big channels who comment on this sort of stuff have read it out loud word for word and said, yeah, I guess I never thought of it that way. I will link it down in the doobly-doo. It's a very good little thing to get acquainted with the whole idea of what this video is about, and essentially pertains to the experience that this person started to make once they transitioned from being perceived as female to being perceived as male. Now, the end of the post ascribes all of this shit to white imperialism, which usually when that kind of thing happens, when you deal in the circles of ideology, you roll your eyes and go, well, but their overall point was correct. But it really plays heavily into the context of this video, so I need to address this. This is actually a global historical phenomenon. And I don't know how else to put this except by saying, did you know brown people are also their own cultural agents who make their own culture based on what they themselves believe? They create their own social constructs proactively. They are not some sort of dynamic NPC world that reacts to the actions of white people. They are also fully formed human beings with a capacity to be evil just like anyone else. I know this is a very overdrawn and facetious way of characterizing that kind of label, but I see this shit all of the time, and people seem to not be aware of how unfathomably racist it is. There is no such thing as the noble savage. But that's not what any of this video is about. I think I can pretty unequivocally refer to the same concept by calling it patriarchy. Because that's what it is. It's patriarchy. It is the socially constructed array of norms and expectations that shapes much of our thinking. And believe it or not, men as a gender are also victimized by it. A major way in which this happens is social isolation and emotional starvation. A quote that really stuck with me from that post is, "The human species looks so much colder from this side." And a metaphor that has done much the same is the concept of chronic emotional malnutrition. Most men just do not receive a sufficient amount of emotional validation, and we as a gender are gaslit about it. Because it's not like we never get any emotional nutrients at all. We do get served 3 meals a day. They're just ever so slightly too small to cover our actual emotional nutritional needs as human beings. And what's funny about this is that the idea that all men have a right to having their basic emotional needs met is considered an absurd masculine entitlement by society. The way most people think about it is that men don't have any real feelings and they don't need affection. So a great number of us atrophy. We become these husks of emotional numbness, alternating with unbridled fury at the unfairness of the world. And then a lot of those men develop these incredibly complex coping models on how the world works and how that is the reason that we are starved of affection, which is a need that we can barely identify at all. Incels are just one of the many examples of this that have sprung up over the years. The viewpoint of that original Tumblr post is interesting because it originates in the experience of having been perceived as both of the major genders throughout their life. But it's not like you need to be a trans man or trans woman for that matter. It's the other way around, but it still has a comparable baseline of experiences to develop an understanding and perhaps a little bit of empathy for these issues and what it does to men. The way the poster described it was mourning the loss of a privilege that came with being perceived as female that he didn't even know he'd had. And I must admit that I am at least a little bit irritated, if not at all surprised, that it took a post by a trans person to even give this issue any kind of legitimacy at all, because men have been talking about this for decades, if not centuries. It's just that the reaction that they usually get is being laughed at by both men and women. They are not taken seriously because we as a society have decided that men cannot have legitimate grievances. And as I make this video to sort of illuminate a grander picture of the scale at which this is happening, to try and put a little bit of empathy and understanding in your head, potentially reach across the gender aisle, I will say that the fact that men are not listened to, but belittled when it comes to things like this, is very much by design. That impulse you may be feeling right now to just dismiss this whole issue out of hand, that is what patriarchy has taught you. Starving men of emotional intimacy and affection is one of the primary mechanisms through which men are controlled in patriarchal society. And by this, I very explicitly do not mean just sex, even though sex is something that a lot of men have a maladaptive hyperfixation on. You see this everywhere, from the father who doesn't show his son any kind of affection unless he's achieved something truly exceptional, to the wife or girlfriend who punishes the man by giving him the cold shoulder, starving him of emotional affection so next time he will know better and do what she wants. Or actually, let's consider for a moment the concept of the sex strike, which is basically, women, do not give your man sex unless he believes X. Or the, personally to me, much funnier, women do not give your man sex until issue Y is resolved by society. That is a full English breakfast of patriarchal bullshit. First of all, it's the whole underlying idea of women don't enjoy or want sex, they just endure it, paired with its ever-present partner in crime, all men want is sex. Just the idea that sex should be a transactional good that can be given or taken away from anyone to make them do what you want is so disgusting to me. Sex is not an entitlement. It is something you do with other people because you want to be physically intimate with them. And look, people have sexual needs, and it is entirely legitimate to have those sexual needs. And especially for men, they do tend to be linked very closely with the need for emotional validation, which once again is by design. So if you turn sex into a means of enacting control over a partner by denying them emotional validation, that is not only highly anti-feminist, because you are reducing the woman essentially to the provider of sex, objectifying her. It's also abuse. Like, it's just plain and simple emotional abuse, like any other kind of emotional withholding. Emotional validation is a key part of the majority of romantic relationships, and if that is something you need, and it's something your partner isn't giving you, you should probably leave. Because either they just cannot give you what you need out of a relationship that makes you happy, like, maybe they're asexual, or maybe they have some sort of psychological disorder that makes them incapable of feeling emotions. Could be any number of entirely legitimate things. Or they do not see you as a human being with needs that are as valid as their own, and are willing to use their power over your emotional needs to control you. There's many ways in which this happens to women also, of course, and usually it involves like the men denying the resources to those women that traditionally under patriarchal gender norms they control. And of course, the all-time classic, not so much taking something away, but giving them a fist to the face. Actual domestic violence, which you could say is taking away their feeling of safety still. Not to mention the emotional component that swings in that as well. And we rightly condemn these things. They are disgusting. And yet a huge portion, if not most of society on some level, considers actual for real emotional abuse to be entirely reasonable as a tool to make men do what you want. This has some parallels in how mental health and physical health are not seen as the same level of priority, even though they should be. Fundamentally, the experience of being a man is that you are not allowed to take up emotional space. At the same time, especially in traditional heterosexual relationships, but also sometimes, unfortunately, relationships of other kinds, as a man, you are still expected to deal with and often regulate the emotional state of your partner or partners. Try denying that, and you will very quickly hear, not just from your partner, complaints about how you never listen and you are so cold, jump-starting a doom spiral of emotional neglect. A doom spiral in which men, by the way, very much do not have the upper hand, and we'll get into why that is a bit later. In the cultural zeitgeist of today, when a man is being emotionally withholding, that is considered a grave transgression. But when it's done to a man, oh, that's female entitlement. That's destroying male privilege and denying him the things he thinks he's entitled to just because he's a man. Happy wife, happy life is something you have heard. It is a deeply ingrained fixture in dating culture, and has been for a while. Of course, if you're constantly doing emotional labor for someone else, that leaves no room for your own emotions. All those "I hate my wife" jokes, those are basically married incels who have lived under the happy wife, happy life paradigm for too long. Honestly, straight dating culture is just full of toxicity in general. And yes, of course, I have to say, because that is the cultural expectation when you talk about men's issues, you need to pay lip service to women's issues, because it is not a legitimate conversation unless you do that. But all of these things are also used against women in some situations, and in those cases, we rightly consider them to be fucked up. But this video isn't about those times. And all of this is especially fucked up because the reason so many men are emotionally withholding by default is because from a very early age, their emotions are used to manipulate them. I've talked about this in a video from earlier this year, which was a sort of guide on how to be a modern masculine man under a feminist paradigm, which you should watch and you should follow the advice on, no matter what your gender is, because it's very cool and liberating and better than living under patriarchal gender norms. But men are deliberately alienated from their own emotions from a very young age in a way that women are just not. Because if we are alienated from one of our most basic human needs, we become easier to control. And patriarchy is all about conformity and control. The thing is, most of the women today, I feel like, they're on, at least the ones I know, they're on the level about this. Like, they get that men are suffering, even if they're not entirely sure why or how. But they do wish it weren't so. They wouldn't dream of manipulating a guy's emotions. But most of the men I know are also on the level when it comes to women's issues. And that hasn't made that gone away in society overnight. Even when most people agree that something is a problem and work against fixing that problem, a small number of victimizers can still set the pace for how quickly that can happen. Because it's not just one victim per victimizer. You can have a lot of victims and have a vastly outsized impact. The problem is that we do not take men's emotional starvation or men's issues in general Seriously. Are you hearing yourself thinking, oh, well, but those are not like the real big kind of problems, the problems that I as a woman or whatever marginalized group that I am have to deal with, because I can. Look, I have seen the wokest, most cool and enlightened of women fall back onto patriarchal gender norms when it suited them. My favorite thing when it comes to this, the best example really, is homelessness. 70% of homeless people are men. Homelessness is clearly and unequivocally a gendered issue that disproportionately affects men. It also just so happens to be one of those icky social issues that we've kind of just accepted are a thing. And, it's unfortunate on some abstract level, but let's not get our hands too dirty thinking about it too much. Except, of course, when one day you're on the train and you read that PSA. 30% of homeless people are women. How terrible! Think about, what that means. Really think about what that means in factual terms. You think if the sign said 70% of homeless people are men, it would have even nearly the same emotional impact? It should have more of an emotional impact because it is more people suffering, but all you would get is someone with a black Sharpie writing fuck sexism over it and complaining about the erasure of homeless women. Complaining about the erasure of homeless men, on the other hand, which is what happens with this issue every single fucking day, feels kind of absurd. Why is that? Is it somehow more okay when men are homeless? Or is it perhaps that feeling that in spite of the enlightened age we live in, we cannot fully shake that because they're men, it's kinda their own fault? I mean, they kind of deserve it, don't they? They are men. They're the people who make society, right? The guy with the cardboard sign sitting outside of the supermarket has at no point in his life been even remotely on track to becoming a patriarch. Another classic example that I really, really love is the issue of custody battles, where men are thoroughly and systemically discriminated against to a laughable degree. It's absurd. And when you bring this kind of thing up, the main contention appears to be that, the real reason for this is the insulting belief that women are better caregivers, and that is why custody courts rule in their favor more often. And that's messed up because it's so insulting to women. Sit down for a moment, please, and just think about the fact that there is a guy here who has to live with the unspeakable agony of not being able to see his kids, whom he loves more than anything in the world, and whom he wants to be there for and take care of. He wants to be a part of their life. And let's be fucking real here for a moment. The reason he can't be is most likely to be an emotional abuse tactic by a vindictive ex. And all you can think about is how the systemic insinuations that this carries are insulting to you on some sort of abstract level. Is that messed up? Sure. But is it really comparable to the utter emotional decimation of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not potentially millions of men around the world? What about a woman being forcibly separated from her child in favor of the father? That changes the emotional landscape of the issue a little bit, doesn't it? It's almost like the emotions of women are more legitimate than the emotions of men. And the more you become aware of this, the more you see it everywhere. Exactly the same as with women's issues. And when you point it out, people will do all manner of mental gymnastics to dismiss you. Exactly the same as with women's issues. This is nothing but a manifestation of the old patriarchal rule. Men are never supposed to complain about their problems, no matter how unbearable they are. You either fix it or you shut the fuck up. Anything else is whining, and nobody, and I mean nobody, wants to hear a grown man whine. You don't know how deep this goes into men's brains. It's so fucking deep in there. It's like the first thing we are told in life. Because of our alienation from ourselves as emotional beings, we develop a slew of psychological problems. But as a man, unless you are lucky and have exceptionally good friends, which I can say I do, you are just alone. You are utterly alone. You need to figure it out, and your friends will not help you. Even the ones who very loudly proclaim that they will never do that, many of them actually do when they discover that, it's actually work. You have to do work when you're helping a friend through like a rough patch. I'm really not into the whole work aspect of that. There are no social consequences to abandoning a man emotionally. What happens instead is that the man who was abandoned gets dehumanized and demonized by the people who at some point called themselves his friends. They just come up with a simple narrative to alleviate their own guilt, and that's that. Plus, society also leaves men alone on a systemic level. We have access to a lot fewer mental health resources, and that doesn't just mean that we can't get into therapy spots as easily as women can. If you're a victim of domestic violence, a lot of places, as a man, you cannot call the cops because you will be arrested. The man is always the perpetrator. There are all manner of phone lines and support groups available to help women face the systemic problems that they deal with every day. Very few to none for men. I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out that the majority of the infrastructure that exists to help men that tells them, yes, I will help you out of whatever fucking shit you're in, I will help you improve and get better, are misogynistic pickup artist Greek alphabet enthusiasts. How the fuck do you think so many men get caught up in those cults? They all get you by saying, hey, listen, no, I know you're feeling down, I know, and that's terrible, and society really is unfair, and I'm gonna show you how you can conquer that, how you can stop feeling like shit all the time. Not only are men highly emotionally vulnerable to that kind of thing, they're also funneled into it by the constant rejection that they experience for the mere act of having problems by the rest of society. I remember very vividly sitting on a train with a friend of mine who was just devastated because he had just had the shit beaten out of him at home. I was way out of my depth, I had no idea what to do, but there was one of those stickers that you find in like public places that get, oh, like trouble at home? Call here. So we called them. They heard his voice, listened to the problem, and then the moment it turned out that he was the one at the receiving end of the violence, they told him that they do not work with men and hung up on him. We were like 14-ish. The person who had beaten him was his mother. Even when you are a teenager, as a man, you are always left to fight your own battles against no matter the type of overwhelming force. Because you, as a man, have no right to clog up the resources for more important people. He attempted suicide a couple weeks after that. He survived, luckily. But I was one of the few people who even had been vaguely aware of potentially seeing this coming. Like, everyone else was just so incredibly surprised that this happened. Because it takes a lot for a man to share his problems with literally anyone, to seek any sort of help. When men say that they didn't see their friend's suicide coming, they mean it. And it's not because they're like dull in empathy or they're assholes and they don't really pay attention to how their friends feel. It's because as a man, what you do when you are facing that kind of problem is go to any lengths necessary to hide it from anyone who is close to you. Something that I think a lot of women have a hard time wrapping their head around is the concept that there is no such thing as a confraternity, a feeling of camaraderie in being a man. Among women, there is a camaraderie in womanhood, the whole, girls gotta stick together spiel. When it comes to strangers, women feel safer around other women. Men not so much. Unless they have a good reason not to, women will default to working together and looking out for each other. There is a tenderness, a gentleness, kindness to the way that women tend to interact with each other, and it only grows as those women grow closer. And it's very difficult to explain to women, I have found. It's such an immense struggle to try to make clear that no such thing exists among men. But that is where the, for men, usually very confusing idea of the boys' club comes from, especially in like highly competitive fields. There's a lot of hostility that you experience when you enter those fields as a woman. Just, being belittled for not knowing shit, generally being treated like shit, receiving no empathy or support from the people who you think are supposed to give you that. The thing about that is, that's just what it's like being a man. Like, that's just what it is. That's the essence of that, especially in those kinds of fields. This is how men are treated also. All the sexual harassment women receive in those fields, that's because they're women. That most definitely. That doesn't happen so much to men. And being a woman also makes them an easier target for all of the toxic masculinity practices that happen. But they don't stop when you leave the room. They just become the thing that all men are constantly doing to each other. And this heartlessness isn't just limited to the competitive wilderness. Men will be friends for 40 years and not touch each other physically in any way for that entire time. They will never know each other's worries, emotions, feelings, traumas, none of that shit. Because you just don't talk about it. You do not talk about it. You keep it to yourself. For a huge number of men, days, if not weeks, go by without anyone reaching out to them. Even close male friends tend to be in touch rather irregularly. This may sound like an exaggeration, but it is still the norm for male friendships. Why do you think so many men just become obsessed with any woman that shows them the barest bit of kindness? Men are starved of kindness. It is not something we encounter in our lives. And according to the gender norms which were instilled in us, a woman is the only kind of person you are allowed to have that sort of emotional relationship with. Usually that woman is supposed to be your partner. And it is unfathomably unhealthy to give just one person absolute power over your entire supply of emotional intimacy. It also saddles that person with an immense responsibility. But patriarchy expects men to make do on that and then shut the fuck up. Never try to get that from someone else. You can probably imagine the kind of power this gives a bad actor over a man's emotional well-being. When you're a man, people just sort of assume that everything is fine with you. They don't want to think that maybe it's not. And when you explain or let shine through that actually it isn't, you would be shocked at the number of people who get actually angry about that because you just destroyed the image they had of you as a guy with whom everything is fine. So it's better to laugh it off or make an awkward joke. I have lost friendships because of this personally, and this is an extremely common experience among men. The moment it becomes clear you are suffering from something, people just sort of drop you. Every man has a story like this. The threshold for when a man is annoying for having emotional needs is much lower than it is for women. When a guy is down bad, when he's really, really sad, the social conditioning in our heads is to think that, that's pathetic. A lot of people are lonely, and a lot of people are alone, but only for men is this seen as a reflection of their value as a human being. And this is just one of the many deeply held beliefs that is ingrained into men from early childhood. If a man has no value and doesn't bring anything to the table in a relationship, and by this I mean any kind of relationship, not just a romantic relationship, he is shunned. And it's not just considered socially acceptable to do this, it's also that if you associate with shunned men openly, that lowers your social status. You can think of equivalencies to this probably in your own life. There are very sophisticated social mechanisms to isolate men from their social groups simply because their mask of perfect self-contained masculinity slipped like once. You're not entitled to have emotional needs. You are not entitled to being treated like a human being. Society loves to forget and works really hard to keep out of its mind that men can suffer at all. And when we are forcibly reminded of it, we always find some way to either dismiss it or reframe it as a good thing. That's why men keep it all in. That's why the very thought of talking about shit with other people, even if those people are among those who would be entirely accepting and helpful of that, just the risk of exposing yourself is not worth it. So you step back and let other people's problems take up the stage. Real problems. This is pure, unadulterated torture of the soul every single day. But for a plurality, if not the majority of men, that is just the reality of our lives every single day. It is what it is. And you move on, and eventually you die. And while we do love imagining all those hyper-masculine men saying, "Oh, stop whining, you sissy," let's not forget how often women go, a man can't take up emotional space. Oh, what an inconvenience. What a problem that it is you have. I bring this up again because I just want to remind you that by doing that, every time you do it, you are reinforcing patriarchal gender norms. I just want to point that out. And of course you get the heaviest backlash of this from men, but, just like how the majority of the people doing slut shaming are women, that doesn't make it not patriarchy. I know that there are some people watching this right now, especially among the women, who are having a difficult time imagining that any of this is really the case even. It's pretty abstract. It's terrible in a way that really, how could that be true? It just sounds implausible to the point of being impossible. These problems that I have listed, they must in some form be an exaggeration. Others, and I do say this very clearly, may be rather familiar with the insecurities and some of the treatment attached to this. Those would pretty much all of them be women who were emotionally neglected during childhood or some other important phase of their lives. And that's exactly the point. Emotional neglect is fundamentally how we raise boys and how we treat men. That is the default way of doing it. And the lived experience of being a man reinforces all of those insecurities and all of the traumas that you have every single day. You know how there's a lot of men who just don't understand the frequency and intensity with which women suffer from sexual harassment? The guys who, they cannot imagine that it could be, it has to be exaggerated. It's such a horrible thing that is being described to them. That can't be the case, really. Most of the people who grow up female have no frame of reference for the degree of isolation and loneliness that men experience throughout their lives. There is a reason why this post was put into words by a trans person. And look, here's the thing about that. It's fine to not have that frame of reference. How would you? I'm glad you don't have that frame of reference, frankly, if you're one of the people who doesn't understand this. It shouldn't happen to people. Not to mention, it's in the very nature of the problem that men do not articulate this, so, how would you know? But it's not some arcane knowledge that is somehow impossible to understand. This isn't like the Necronomicon of emotional neglect, right? I'm just trying to make you think about how bad it really is. Make the effort to empathize. Whenever I talk about the emotional experience of being a man, to women specifically, because men, when you bring this up, they can get very, very uncomfortable and just immediately crush the conversation into a completely different direction. What I hear very often are things like, oh yeah, I mean, no, that's different, and oh no, well, you misunderstood that, and no, that's not really emotional abuse, and oh, well, that kind of you brought on yourself, really, that's your fault. Do those turns of phrase maybe, potentially remind you of anything? Like, I don't wanna like lean out the window a bit too much here, but perhaps some sort of complex social phenomenon that women experience a lot? Yes, I have outright mentioned this before in the video, but it is no secret that a lot of women, probably most women, are really rather worried about the risk of sexual assault. They think about this a lot. It is a major fear they have. And while obviously the main primary victims of this social phenomenon are women, like, this is not a point of contention, nor is the point here being made that it even makes sense to compare, like, the trauma dick size of the different gendered experiences of anything. Like, that's just generally stupid to compare trauma. Men also suffer immensely from the ripple effect of just how prevalent sexual harassment and sexual assault are in our society. As a guy, you walk down the street and people treat you warily. Everywhere you go, people treat you like you're some kind of wild animal. Not even a tiger or something cool like that, but like a possum or a skunk. I think this does really play a part in why so many men sort of embrace that predator mindset, because they want to feel like a tiger, as fucked up as that sounds. And I do mean everyone, by the way. As I have said before, men do not feel safe around men either. We all know there's some weird fucking dudes out there, and there's no point in placing yourself in unnecessary danger. As a guy, when you're out and it's dark, people in general will just move to the other side of the street, no matter if they're men or women. They might check if you're following them subtly, or, shift their body weight in order to be able to attack or flee more quickly. Especially women will often feel threatened in a rather obvious way if you're, attuned to other people's body language at all, and engage in all manner of avoidance behavior. The kind of shit that you do with wild animals, or like a gang of bullies. Don't show vulnerability, appear like more trouble than you're worth, and above all, ensure that no interaction happens. Stay aloof. Do not explicitly acknowledge their existence. And you do this not because you hate animals, or because you hate that particular animal in question even. You might even want to go over there and pet it, because apparently some people think that possums are cute. But you don't do that. You keep up the force field, because it's a wild animal. It could be fine, but it is unpredictable, so that's really not a risk that you take. But this isn't just like walking down the street, like off the street. When women find guys interesting, they will ask other women that know that guy, even if maybe, those women don't really know each other very much. There's like an unspoken agreement that you can go there as a woman and ask, hey, is he safe to be around? Or to bring this back to the street, have you ever noticed that when you're hanging out with like your girlfriend or a female friend in public, women that you meet will be like much more open and nice and kind to you, like smile at you and stuff. That's them dropping part of their force field, because the presence of another woman there signals to them, okay, this guy apparently not an immediate danger or predator. Women are like elite counterintelligence officers, always thinking of the escape routes, the ways that they could get out of any given situation, the ways that others could use to attack them. They have James Bond level technologies to check drinks for roofies, or make sure that no one has broken into their apartment in their absence and is waiting for them there. They are streetwise as hell when it comes to being around men, in ways that we men just never even think about. And I, as a man, see all of this and think to myself, yeah, good. Like, stay safe out there. There's some fucking actually really legitimately weird and creepy fucking guys who are actually after you. God fucking speed. You don't need me to tell you that. And it's so fucked up that women have to go through all this just to keep themselves safe from a very real danger of sexual assault. It shouldn't be like this. It just should not be like this. Women should be able to feel safe wherever they go, whenever they go there, and more importantly, dressed however they like. That's a very crucial point of contention. Sexual assault is not something that anyone should have to be afraid of. And this entirely legitimate skill set that women use to protect themselves from a small but, vastly outsized impact-having group of men are really just very psychologically damaging to the men they run into on a daily basis. Because 99% of the time, the guy at the other end of that interaction is not a predator. It's just a guy, never seriously considered hurting a living soul. But he still gets treated like a potential predator, and that makes him feel utterly alone, like just an outcast to society itself. Even if he understands why women do this and that it has nothing to do with him personally. Our hypersocial primate brains are just hardwired to perceive that as complete, total, utter, devastating rejection. It just rips open all of the scars of emotional neglect that we run around with anyway. And I cannot overstate how legitimate it is for women to protect themselves in this way. As much as I might hate that they have to do this, they have every right to do it. And I know for a fact that the overwhelming majority of women also do not want to have to do this in order to be safe. So in no conceivable way at all could this possibly be interpreted as me saying that women should stop looking out for their own safety because it hurts men's feelings. It is very important to me to be entirely unambiguous about that. Women didn't choose to live in a world that is like this, and neither did guys. But that is factually part of the fallout that it creates. This random, entirely peaceful guy feels like everyone is afraid of him, especially women who are supposed to be the people who are interested in him for him to have any sort of value as a human being. This is another key aspect of male socialization, the idea that you are only worth something if women are interested in you. Now, this is a story all about how my personal experience with this has been. And I realize that the specifics of this are not going to be applicable to most men, because I do know that maybe even most men, if not a huge number of them, in the industrialized world still do not have proper sex education. That just does not happen in school. But I think a lot of men will be able to relate to the takeaways that I have from this, from living in the world. Guys who aren't complete assholes, I think, might recognize a lot of themselves as beings in the sexual space. As a 90% straight cis guy, in the society that I grew up in, ever since I discovered busting, basically, I was taught that my sexual desires were inherently dangerous to the women that I wanted to fuck. We had an extracurricular sex ed thing where there was a whole segment on rape and consent, which I know it's crazy that, a lot of people can't even imagine something like that happening. But actually, it left me fucking horrified. Because my main takeaway from this was, and I'm sure it wasn't put this way explicitly, it's just what my young brain took away from it, the impression it left on me, is that every time a woman sleeps with me, I am inherently taking something away from her. And it's not that women somehow hate sex, but that because I am a man, basically any kind of contact or intercourse that can happen must always be the result of my presence being an intimidating form of coercion. No true consent can ever really be 100% established. I've never wanted to hurt anyone, at least not in that way. But what I went home with that day from school, what I had basically brought in my backpack, was the idea that because I'm a man, eventually I'm just gonna rape a bitch. That's just going to happen, even though I really do not want it to. That is the level of vulgarity with which it is part of my experience and self-perception. I found that very traumatic, and I really do not want to know what it is that they taught the girls, because I assume it was even worse. Many of the ideas presented to me there have been reinforced by things that I have seen in popular culture, like the notion that men rape because because they are desperate for sex. I've never felt the urge to do that, no matter how horny I was. There's never something that even has remotely entered my mind. And that made me think that there was something wrong with the way that my sexuality works. Like, I'm supposed to want to sexually assault. Like, if that's not what is happening in my head, I'm not a real man. And at the same time, in parallel to all this, I also had the idea in my head that my carnal desires are fundamentally an evil that society puts up with because it has to. It really fucked up how I relate to my own sexuality. I still have massive issues, like making clear to people that I am interested in them, or that I find them attractive especially, because I am repulsed by the idea that I might make anyone feel unsafe. And I'm pretty sure that has not really led to a healthy relationship with myself or the way I interact with women. I don't think that that's a likely result of that kind of conditioning, socially speaking. But this notion of you need to be kept in check and every once in a while someone might let you hurt them for your pleasure, that's something that I know a lot of men have in their heads and that they struggle with. Just guilt over the fact that I can get my dick hard. Shame every time I had consensual sex with someone. While at the same time measuring your entire self-worth as a man by how much you've fucked. That also is branded into a lot of men's brain folds. So if you don't do it, you're ashamed too. You're always ashamed. I feel like probably a lot of LGBTQ plus people can relate to the idea of being ashamed of your own sexuality. But it's not okay for men to be ashamed of their own sexuality, because of course all of society is built to cater to male sexuality, and they're the predators, they're the perpetrators. No wonder so many men dull their empathy and just become consumed by rage every once in a while. Who wants to feel like this? The issue of sexualized violence is so prevalent and so impactful that it hurts everyone in society. And it is in everyone's interest to solve it, because it is annihilating to the soul to be perceived as a predator all the time. And just as a side note, black men, or men from any other minority group, experience this a lot more even, because they often are additionally considered to be dangerous predators because people think of them as criminals. Even though, and I really hope that the people are going to be saying in the comments, duh, why did you have to point that out? That's such an obvious statement. But even though the overwhelming majority of them will never even commit a single crime in their entire lives. Like maybe jaywalking, but who doesn't do that? Me, I don't do that. But that's because I'm German, so it's really more of a neurological problem. This actually brings me to a perfect intersection of society's devaluation of male life and men's inner devaluation of themselves. Men constitute the majority of victims in almost every single category of violent crime. For almost every one of them, 70 to 80% of the victims are men. There are two major categories where that number is inverted, and women constitute the main number of victims, which is, obviously we've talked about this, sexual assault and sexual harassment, rape, all of that entire complex of things, and also being hurt or murdered by a current or former spouse or partner. All the others, men. So it is a little weird that men do not take the same level of precautions when they go out at night. Like, they're just not as scared. Like, sure, I'm not gonna take any insane, unnecessary risk. I'm not gonna pick a fight with a gang of people that I run into, but I'm not gonna clutch my purse and have my heart racing every time someone vaguely sketchy looking comes into my field of vision. And I do think that part of this is that women are taught to be scared more because under patriarchy that makes them easier to control. But I also think there is something to be said that as a guy, chances are, most people you run into, you can at least do some pretty fucking severe damage to them. It's just a biological fact that male body types have a distinct advantage in most combat scenarios. And I think that if we didn't have that, we'd be much more keenly aware that it is the other half of the human population that has that advantage. But that still leaves us with, statistically, men being in more danger. And just from crime, not even all the most dangerous professions are also entirely male-dominated. And look, if you're one of those people who thinks that because it's men doing that crime and victimizing those men, and so therefore it's okay because it's men doing it to men, you are a bad person, and you should be ashamed of yourself. Men aren't even, generally aware of how much more likely they are to be victimized on the streets than women. It's just not something we talk about that much. It's not that big a deal in society. Oh, men are gonna beat each other up. That's just a thing they do. Why, this doesn't need to go on the news. Oh, there was a brawl somewhere. Ooh. And the men that are aware of this often won't value their own lives that much. And yet all of these issues, if they are talked about at all in an accurate way, because I do see a lot of feminists claiming that it's women who are the majority of violent crime victims, which is it's just straight up not true. It's just not a true fact that is factual. It's just wrong. But when it happens, it's usually framed exactly the way that homelessness as an issue is framed. Wow, it's so terrible that 30% of murder victims are women. At least once a month, I see an article pop up about how terrible it is that so many women are dying in the murder capitals of the world. And yeah, of course, that's horrible. It's fucked up. To say it's tragic, it sounds almost facetious. Meanwhile, all these cities still have kind of the same gender murder victim ratio as the most peaceful cities on Earth. It's a big number only because the number of victims in total is astronomically high. There's more than twice as many men being killed, but you don't really see all that many articles lamenting their deaths. Why do we so rarely talk about that? I've seen people say shit like, oh well, that's because it's their own fault. They're all gang members. So, if you're a gang member, of course, that makes you likely to become a victim. Which, first of all, is just factually untrue. It does make you more likely to become a victim of violence when you are a gang member, but the people killed there are not overwhelmingly gang members. But even if they were all gang members, by that logic, when a prostitute gets raped, that's her fault, or what? Think before you speak, moron. And how exactly does them being gang members not make them victims? You think young men join gangs because they have an abundance of career paths open to them? You think it's an even choice between working at Microsoft and MS-13, and they just say to themselves, yeah, I want to become a murderer for a living? Nobody who has the option is gonna deliberately do a career change to start mugging people in the streets. They are forced into this, indoctrinated into the idea that it's cool and based to live the life of a gangster from a very early age. They are literally groomed into this by predatory adults who need bodies for their street gang wars. Does that perhaps sound like some other kind of violent life that young men are indoctrinated into idealizing? But no, look, films that depict war as being cool and fun, and you get to hang out with your friends and shoot guns, that's just the male power fantasy. Men want that kind of thing. Imagine, looking at all the propaganda that young girls are fed that puts the idea into their heads that the only way for them to ever find happiness is to give a lot of kids to their husbands. And seeing that, thinking to yourself, yeah, this caters to the female power fantasy. That would be some deranged psycho shit. There's nothing powerful about stewing in your own shit while freezing in the trenches of Verdun. War is not an entertaining pastime. It is idealized through propaganda to tell men that the most honorable way to die is fighting for what your patriarch believes in. Incidentally, war also rewards men with emotional intimacy, because, being there with your band of brothers and the veterans that you've been through all that war with is one of the few contexts in society where it is acceptable for men to be emotionally intimate with other men. That and competitive sports, because it is essential for patriarchy to function that men be in constant competition with each other. And the more starved of affection men are in regular society, the more willing they become to die in a war. Oh, and I can already see all the screeds typed up in the comments. Oh, this is just because society views women as weak, and that's the problem about this. Personally, I'd rather be seen as weak than being, fucking killed or having to murder someone under the threat of execution. It is being a man that makes it acceptable for you to be treated in this way. Not to mention that, the fact that women are being seen as weak, that is a true fact, and, it's not necessarily accurate, but they still have a sort of protective aura of being women when it comes to most forms of violence that just doesn't apply to men. A weak man is just more likely to get fucked up. A weak woman could beat the shit out of a man in public, and the man would be laughed at for even complaining about it. It happens every day. There's a good to fair chance you've seen it happen yourself. As a society, we continue to victim blame men for their own oppression. And I'm gonna say something very controversial, but nonetheless I believe entirely true here, to drive home how prevalent and especially sneaky patriarchal oppression of men is to this day. Some of the biggest institutions that act as agents of patriarchy when it comes to men today label themselves very explicitly as feminist. Look, I don't love the label feminist for myself, but I will never object to being described as one because, let's be serious, it is accurate. My gripe with the label isn't even just semantical, it's a misunderstanding of the semantics of the label. When I meet someone who describes themselves as a feminist, I think, yeah, this is probably someone I have a lot of overlap with ideologically. But the thing that mainly puts me in that camp is that I am anti-patriarchy, because I think it's a massively oppressive force to the overwhelming majority of the population. And I really hope I've been driving home the point of how the overwhelming majority of the population also means the overwhelming majority of men. Patriarchy as a system separates society into two genders, denying the very existence of all the others, and places very specific expectations upon them. There are, of course, many variations of patriarchy, and patriarchy has adapted over the years, as we will see in a minute. Feminism also defines itself in opposition to patriarchy, because obviously if you want gender equality, you need to get rid of the patriarchy. But in practice, what this has meant up until the current day is that feminism concerns itself primarily with female liberation, which is fighting the patriarchy, but only on one front. And men have been expected to fight on that front as well. But patriarchy is an oppressive force to both of the genders that it recognizes, and if you read feminist deep lore, this becomes very clear. And let's be honest for a moment here, you would also be correct that, at least historically speaking, women have definitely gotten the rougher end of the deal. But as feminist theory itself loves to point out, it's not as easy as tallying up oppression points. These are complex, interlocking social phenomena. Unfortunately, in the modern discourse around gender, the issue of feminism versus patriarchy, even way too often among people who should know better, is understood by most to mean the oppressed women versus the oppressive men. The word that means women is the good guys, and the word that means men is the bad guys, because women are the good guys and men are the bad guys. And that is a fucking stupid framing if you are trying to fight a system that oppresses all the genders. Just because it happens in different ways doesn't mean that it isn't happening to the other people. But here's the kicker. Patriarchy doesn't even mean a society that exploits women for the benefit of men. Patriarchy is a society built for the benefit of patriarchs It's in the name. And most men, it turns out, just are not patriarchs. They're not born into the right social strata and with the right kind of luck to ever even smell the air of being a patriarch. And the men who aren't patriarchs spend their entire lives breaking their backs in the mines. Their existence is dedicated to working for the benefit of their patriarch and going to die for some sort of land acquisition that their patriarch wants to make. Yes, definitely, the average man is going to be one step higher above the average woman in patriarchal society, but there's still an Empire State Building's worth of steps between him and the top where the patriarch sits. Why do you think so many men are obsessed with the notion of a dominance hierarchy? It's another concept that gets drilled into our heads from a young age. The only way for you to be worth something as a man and as a human being is to work your way up the dominance hierarchy, which, isn't really an actual option that people have, but the prospect of it is dangled in front of them so they will do the bidding of the people who were born into a higher station. It's a really neat system for the patriarchs because they have a whole gender that's in competition with itself and works hard to maintain the social order that they benefit from, while at the same time still being able to take out their anger on their wives, so they don't come for the jugular of the patriarchs. And the way that women are treated like a commodity also reinforces that system. Crabs in a bucket. It's basically how capitalism works. But men in patriarchy are not free. They're just a different kind of human currency. Under patriarchy, a woman's life is inherently valuable because she is a breeding machine for children. She's like a nice fancy piece of equipment. A man's life is valuable in terms of manpower, which doesn't mean that they're powerful men. Manpower means corpses. Corpses who ideally, when faced with the corpses of the other patriarch general, will produce more even deader corpses there more quickly than the other way round if the plan goes the way that the patriarch general of this army came up with it. Under the patriarchal paradigm, women are birthing machines and men are dying machines. You send them to die in war, and when it's time to make a choice, it's women and children first, because they can produce more birthers and dyers for the future, or are already the future birthers and dyers. It's the cold calculation of investment. And just to restate this point, if you are one of those people who thinks, it's fine though that these men get sent to war because it's men sending them to war to murder other people, you are an evil human being, a contemptible person with horrible beliefs. And we're back to the women and children first because, that's so terrible, society views women as weak. Think for a moment about how absurd it is to say, do you know how insulting it is that you don't want to be sacrificed to save my life? Feminism has done a lot of fantastic work in liberating women from patriarchal oppression. It has, by and large, as a movement, failed to have the same effect for men. Which isn't to say that, parts of the movement haven't tried, they definitely did, but any of the improvement in oppressive gender norms that has happened is by and large just a side effect of women being liberated. If I were a cynical man, I would say that feminism sold us out, much like the suffragette movement back in the day sold out minorities when they stopped advocating for universal suffrage, trading the position that they thought was more morally acceptable to secure their own rights. But though not entirely incorrect, that would be a little bit of an oversimplification of the matter at hand. But ironically, many feminist institutions have actually become forces that reinforce patriarchal gender norms as they stand for men. And this does not just refer to their inaction while monopolizing the concept concept of gender equality. And it's historically been true as well, like the idea of the white feather, which was given to men who weren't in uniform back in the World War days to shame them for not going to die for their patriarch. The idea was, of course, originated by patriarch generals, but many suffragettes were very quick to jump on that train. There is a blind spot when it comes to the gender norms that oppress men, and it's pretty fucking big and pretty fucking obvious to men. And look, I'm pretty sure that most of the feminist women looking at this video are thinking to themselves, oh yeah, that's horrible. That's a terrible way that men exist. I've thought about this before, but it's always interesting to hear it again. That shit needs to be stopped because they're against patriarchy. But I can also see a lot of people seething about the mere insinuation that feminism might be supporting patriarchal structures. And look, you and your friend group might be very much actively interested and pursuing the goal of liberating men from patriarchy. That's great, and I mean, after all, the idea that men are oppressed by patriarchy is very much feminist theory. Like, this doesn't come from anywhere else. It is from the books. It is rather fucked up that I feel the need to thank you for treating men like human beings, but thank you. That is not actually as common as you think. But just because you are not evil doesn't mean that these norms don't swing around very prevalently among the rest of society. I try to talk to a lot of incel types and like right-wingers in general, because I see it as part of my life mission to sort of find out what it was that drove them to such a ridiculous ideology, and what dark place they are in their life that made them vulnerable to this, and maybe also, if I can, pull them out a little bit. Incels especially, though they define themselves as a reaction to feminism, are massive victims of patriarchy. Like, women in feminism are not to blame for the existence of incels. But I will tell you the same thing I love to tell them. There is no such thing as the feminism. Feminism is not a monolith, and it is not something that exists in objective physics. It's a social construct like gender and patriarchy and a million other things. And you cannot deny that it is so often feminist groups who fight in favor of patriarchal oppression of men when it is them who put massive amounts of money and people power in terms of activism into making sure there are no domestic violence shelters for men. This is plain truth, by the way. Despite making up almost like 40% of the victims of domestic violence, men are critically underserved in this sector, and this is because, very explicitly, very clearly, because they're the only people who really voice their opinion about this politically, feminist groups. But of course, a man who is weak enough to be beaten deserves to be beaten. This is what patriarchy says. You also cannot deny that it has been explicitly feminist groups that have lobbied for legislation worded in a way that rape and sexual assault in general is defined as something that only a man can do and that can never happen to men. Men always need to be willing to take all the sex they can get. Men always want sex, is what patriarchy says. There are many other cases like this, and something they all have in common, luckily, is that, they're not quite fringe positions in the feminist movement, but they're also not necessarily the positions that represent the core of the feminist movement today. But crucially, and this is an argument I get a lot, that doesn't make those other kinds of feminists not feminist. And that doesn't make their feminism not feminism, or even not rooted in actual feminist ideas. How many Christians do you know who eat shellfish? They have one book. Just the one. And it's pretty explicit about that shit, yet you would consider it absurd if someone was called not a real Christian because they eat shellfish. Shellfish fucking rocks. Or to pick an even more topical example, you would consider it absurd that a man who says that men actually should be allowed to have and express emotions would be considered not a real man. And yet you claim that TERFs and SWERFs are not real feminists. You can't say that. What are you, like the CEO of feminism? You can take any ideology and use it to justify anything. You can do mental gymnastics to put any idea into any context and make any passage of text mean anything you want. The discourse is not as purely intellectual as you would like to believe. And in a universe lacking objective morality, your view of what the thing is as legitimate as anyone else's. That's kind of part of the whole social construct deal. But it's something that everyone sort of conveniently forgets the moment it comes to defending their own label or demonizing their opponents. It doesn't matter what the theory says if you can interpret the theory a billion different ways. Not to mention, most people have never even fucking read the theory and they never will. But to swing back around the other way, even though I do think that these anti-male patriarchal positions among feminists and women are somewhat rare, I do think there is a general lack of empathy among them for men's issues. A fundamental unwillingness to even engage with the idea that yes, men have problems too, and they're pretty fucking big. And I think it comes from a similar emotional place of the thing that makes a lot of men into rabid anti-feminists. It's the whole loss of a privilege perceived as discrimination thing. To return to the original Tumblr post for a moment, it points out that women have, for the longest time, had the privilege of being able to exist as emotional beings. They've had a monopoly on all of the emotional real estate. Not all of them, of course, have always claimed that monopoly, much like there's always been men who have chosen to be decent. But now a lot of men, and also a lot of women, are demanding that men get to share that emotional space with women. They also get an even piece of the total real estate. And that to many is just as threatening as the idea that men should share their social privileges with women. Because let's be serious, the way society views women currently at this point in time is as victims of centuries, if not millennia of oppression that need to be helped in order to get justice. There's a lot of emotional capital in that, a lot of social leverage. And for a terrifyingly large number of feminists, justice means we need to punish the men of today for the things that not them, but the men of yesterday did to not us, but the women of yesterday. It is, after all, much easier to hate a particular group of people than some sort of nebulous concept like the patriarchy. And if you're active in feminist circles, be honest with yourself for a minute here. You know people like this. That's okay. A lot of men know incels too. And the thing they all have in common is that they carry a lot of hatred instilled in them by the evils that patriarchy has enacted upon them on the abstract and also often the personal. Except, of course, for them patriarchy means all men. But patriarchy has changed. Patriarchy has learned to survive under a modern, more feminist paradigm. One of the most obvious ways in which this is the case is that patriarchy has allowed a small number of women to become patriarchs. The idea that feminism can be achieved by putting more women into positions of power and authority is a concept that most feminist academics sort of scoff at. And yet, because of course those particular women on their path to becoming patriarchs have a lot of power already and would benefit from having more of it, it is touted as one of the cornerstones of feminist achievements in modern society. But at the end of the day, girl boss mentality is just women working their way up the patriarchal dominance hierarchy. But of course now we're getting into how patriarchy and capitalism are two sides of the same coin, and we really do not have the time for that. The video is long enough as it is. The handle that modern patriarchy uses to make so many aspects of feminism into a tool for itself is the hatred that many women carry for men as a concept. Because no matter how much you intellectualize it, how much you couch it in ideological rhetoric, it is just hatred. It's really funny how ideology so often boils down to everything I do is ontologically justified and I can do no wrong against my evil enemy. And that's why I don't love that label for myself. And if you are a feminist, which I hope you are, maybe consider reflecting upon some of the beliefs that you hold in general, bearing in mind some of the ideas that you've encountered here today. Because you are, I assume, a human being, and much like any other human being, you probably let a lot of shit just slip by because it is done under the label that you identify with. And that's the good guy label, really. Being a feminist does not make you immune to holding patriarchal beliefs. I'm really not asking anyone to abandon being a feminist or calling themselves that. That would be absurd. In fact, I think more people maybe should do that. Think about the ideas that actually entails. I'm saying feminism should and proclaims itself to be the spearhead of all this, when it really isn't. And of course, at the end of the day, all you can do is adjust the framework of your own beliefs, because you cannot and should not be able to control what other people think. None of what has been said here today is to say that somehow men have it worse. Very explicitly, not what I'm talking about. It is to say, men have it bad also, but different. And while a lot exists to address this kind of shit for women, it does not for men. Has a lot of progress been made? Definitely. I actually, personally, in the last 5 years, I've seen a lot of encouraging developments. But imagine for a moment if somebody dismissed the idea that things still need to be done for women based on the idea that a lot of progress has been made. Or you don't need to imagine that. You hear it pretty often. Yeah, men do too. Anyway, there's so much more bullshit I could get into, like how, for instance, capitalists at this point have found out a way to exploit male loneliness by creating abusive AI chatbots. So for patriarchy is going to become an even bigger incentive to make sure men feel lonely and isolated. But the video is already running a little teensy-tiny bit on the longer end. Thank you very much for watching this video. Like, comment, subscribe, share this to your relevant communities, but do not spam them. Consider supporting me on Patreon or Subscribestar, buying some of my merchandise or my short story collection. And in that spirit, I really look forward to seeing a well-regulated and civil, empathetic comment section, not filled with insane incels and femcels and radical feminists and like alpha sigma shrigma male morons. That's definitely not gonna happen. See you around, cunts.